Welcome to the Gen X Journey podcast. Dive into all things important to Gen Xers, from advice on aging parents, expert interviews, product reviews, and heartfelt conversations. So put down the joystick, grab your Walkman, dust off your old yearbooks, and welcome to the Gen X Journey.
Welcome back to the Gen X Journey podcast, and this episode we're going to be talking about the Atari. Keith, load us up, man.
That is for sure. So I tell you what, we had an episode previously about things that impacted Gen X, and there were some events, but I will tell you, I think one of the biggest impacts to our generation was that our generation basically grew up and with the dawn of the video game industry. Do you all agree?
Yes.
That's a big deal to our generation. Yeah. So today I thought I would talk about the granddaddy of them all, and that is the company that we all know as Atari. And anybody that's Gen X is well aware, whether they played games or not, everybody in our generation knows Atari. So I thought I would talk a little bit about the history of Atari, how it came to be, a little bit of side notes on things that happened as Atari was becoming the giant and going into the sunset of its career, and then following a little bit about what Atari is today, and some things that are some really interesting history about in the last couple of years, what they found out about Atari. So anyway, Atari is a brand name that's been owned by several entities, but the one that everybody knows and is near and dear to was the original Atari video game company. And so just want to talk to you a little bit about Atari. So I want to ask you guys, where did the name Atari come from? Do you all know?
I feel like we've talked about this before, but
was it the inventor's dog's name or something like that?
It was not, and I don't think we have, because when I was learning this, I was really fascinated by it. It's some interesting stuff. So it was actually.
It's doesn't it come from the Japanese game Go? Like
yes, it does. You Google bastard.
No,
you cheater. You cheater. No,
I'm kidding.
It all came back to me.
Yeah, sure, sure it did.
I think Nolan Bushnell was the founder of Atari.
Yes, so there were two, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. They were the first. There were the two people. Ironically, this is what is really fun about Atari, and I just discovered this. Atari was created and incorporated on June 27th, 1972, one day before I was born.
Wow.
Really?
Cool? Yeah. So
wow.
In 1971, Nolan Bushnell, as you were talking about, and Ted Dabney, they founded a small engineering company. It's called like Syzygy or Syzygy Engineering, Syzygy. And they designed a computer game called Computer Space. And it was basically the first commercially available arcade video game. And what was interesting about it, if you look at it, it's very much a precursor to what the game Asteroids was in a way. Basically, you had this spaceship in the middle of the screen, and there were two UFOs that you had to bring down. But anyway, so they made enough money off of this company to form and incorporate Atari. And yeah, you're right, Noel. Atari, the name Atari was created by the Ted, Mr. Bushnell. Nolan was a big fan of that game Go, and so that is where that movie or that game was or the name was created by. And the interesting about this, this is a little tangent I want to talk about that I think is funny. So in the thing that's ironic about this being named after Go is that the game of Go is actually one of the hardest games for a computer to be able to understand and figure out. Like, they can play chess and all these other things, but Go is a challenging game that's hard for computers to understand how to compete against a human. And in fact, in 2010, there was a movie called Tron Legacy, and an interesting little Easter egg in that movie, there's a lady that played by Olivia Wilde. Her name was Cora. And in that movie, they're in the grid, which is they go back into the computer system, and there is a game system of Go in the grid. And she looks at it and she says, I have such a hard time beating Kevin Flynn at this game. And so it's really interesting because Kevin Flynn is the actual human and she's a computer. And even there, they're having this callback that Go is hard for a computer to learn. So it's kind of interesting. But anyway, so that's where the name Atari came from, was Go. And basically what it is, it's a situation. Its meaning is to hit a target in Japanese, and in Go, it's a situation where a player will be able to capture one or more stones in the next move. So anyway, so I thought that was interesting. The Atari logo was actually designed by a gentleman named George Opperman, who was Atari's first in-house graphic designer. And it was drawn by an individual by the name of Evelyn Soto. So the design is actually nicknamed Fuji because it resembles the Japanese mountains. So interesting thing about this is a lot of people, assume that Atari was probably created through Japan like Nintendo and others, but it was definitely created in California. So it's a U.S. company. But anyway, so Opperman designed the logo intending for the silhouette to look like the letter A as in Atari, but also for its three prongs to resemble players in the midline of the court in the company's first hit game. What was the first hit game that Atari came out with?
Pong.
Pong. Yeah. So Pong.
72?
That's right. Yep. Just after they launched the company, Pong was the game that was created, and it was basically it was Al Alcorn, who was their first design engineer. Mr. Bushnell asked him to produce an arcade version of Magnavox Odyssey's tennis game, which would be named Pong. So interesting stuff that was the first game, and that's basically how the logo was originated. It was supposed to look like the Pong board in an A shape. So interesting there. So yeah, so as Atari grew, it became a big powerhouse, creating so Pong was obviously the first home design system with the two knobs and things that you could play on a screen. But as it got smarter, they started evolving. They would create definitely would create the first video game system for Atari. Now it's later named the 2600, which everybody knows, but it was actually, believe it or not, originally named the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS. So Atari VCS, and back in 1975, when this was created, the introductory price was $199, which, interestingly enough, if you look at inflation, that was the equivalent of $1,066 as of just a few years ago.
Wow.
So super pricey console for what it was. And it included two joysticks, a pair of paddles, and the game cartridge of Combat. So did y'all play Combat?
Ooh. Oh, heck yeah, man.
Oh yeah.
I don't remember that one.
You don't remember that? A couple of tanks and the barriers and all that.
Tanks.
So,
it was more like a red blob with the blue blob and a little nub.
Yep, that was pretty much
it. You had to imagine that was they
called
it
tanks.
Part.
Yep, absolutely.
And it shot a little ball missile.
Yep. It's so
you had to really be very creative video game player back then. You had to imagine not only the game but also like
what they were.
Yeah.
Yep. Like
I always used like the video, because the video cartridge like that they came in had the pictures of what it was supposed to look like, and you're like, oh my goodness, and then you crank it up and you're like, that's a red blob.
Right.
That's
Totally.
not a tank. Yeah,
no doubt. It's crazy. And so, yeah, interesting enough, the Atari 2600, they actually was originally sold by Sears. So Sears had pretty much the proprietary rights of the Atari 2600 to sell it. And it actually, even Sears only had a few proprietary games. I think there were 3 that were only sold through Sears. So can you imagine? I mean, I don't know. Wow. Sears isn't even around anymore, but that was the company that they thought would launch the Atari. So pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was basically the advent of Atari. Now, there's a lot of different things that's happened since the Atari came out. Do you all know how many in total 2600 games were created?
Oh my gosh.
I'll say like 500-ish.
Yeah, you're right. 523 games.
Boom.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And they were basically divided into 3 sections. And so this is interesting. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there were games that were published by Atari and Sears, interestingly enough. There were games published by third parties, and then hobbyist developed games after the system was discontinued. So if you're looking at the actual total amount of games that were created for Atari at the time, it was actually, let me see. I had it just a second ago. Where the heck did it go? It was like 400 something, but it was close to about 400. But these third party people, after it was done, who created like different types of the Atari games, it ended up being over 400. So interesting stuff. So yeah, a lot of games. And so that was really at the advent of games. They were really trying to rush a bunch of things to market, and really kind of what caused Atari's downfall is because 2 things. They were really concerned about the people who were developing the games getting a lot of credit. So here's an interesting story. A lot of the games that came out, they did not give the people who were the creators of the software credit for making those games. Okay. And so that was where the creation of the first Easter egg was ever invented. So if you know what an Easter egg is, if you don't, an Easter egg is something that's in a movie or in a video. It actually started with the video game Adventure and the Atari 2600. So there was a gentleman who created the Atari 2600 game Adventure. His name was Warren Robinett. Okay. And Warren Robinett was kind of upset that he could not get credit for creating this game. He really thought it was a great game and wanted to make sure he was going to get some credit for it. So while he was creating the video game, he was able to hide through some really tricky imagination and calculations, hide a little single bit of a dot inside a dark room. And you had to like scour the side of these walls and had to go get a bridge and all sorts of stuff to get to it. But anyway, this little dot unlocked this secret room, and inside the secret room was the words that said "created by Warren Robinett." And that was the first ever Easter egg, and it was in the game Adventure. So anyway, but what's interesting about this is that there were a lot of different creators of the video games that decided to leave Atari and form other studios, and the most notable of the studios that they created was Activision. And Activision is still a company that's pretty popular today. I think Activision Blizzard, right, is one of the big stock trading companies out there. So there were game designers like David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Milber, and Bob Whitehead, and they really wanted recognition for their creative contributions and ownership over their work. So they left Atari, but interestingly enough, they were one of the biggest third-party supporters to the Atari console. So they created games like Pitfall, like River Raid, all of these games that probably a lot of us remember as some of the best games for the Atari system were created through Activision, and it was by the people that left because they were a little upset about the management and the corporate structure of what it was like. When a couple of years after they've created this company, they sold it to Warner. And Warner was kind of the reason why there was problems, because they were really solely designed on focusing on hardware and didn't understand the value of good software and the good software engineers. And so that's kind of where a lot of the mismanagement of Atari came to be. And so that was really where, when everything started getting oversaturated, and people started seeing that Atari was just trying to pump out these mid-quality games, not great quality games at all, that people started losing faith in the company a little bit, to say that, we're paying, X amount of dollars for video games, but we're not really getting the value that we think that we should be getting. One example of that is the best-selling video game for the Atari 2600 of all time. Do you all know who or which one that was? Pac-Man. Yes. Pac-Man was the biggest selling Atari video game of all time. It was released in 1982, and that game sold over 7 million copies, and it was the highest selling Atari game of all time. Now, that being said, it was terrible. Do you all remember playing this?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah.
Really poor graphics. The gameplay was terrible. It wasn't anything remotely like what you played in the arcade. So it was a massive disappointment.
Yeah, totally. So it's pretty bad that that this port was such a fail. I mean, I remember looking at it when it came out. I think the excitement about this game was so high. I remember everybody talking about we're going to have this at home, and it was such a disappointment. They made up for it later. I thought Miss Pac-Man was good, and apparently my mom did too, because she would like completely confiscate my 2600 and play in the back room. I was so mad, but that's okay.
You're grounded for the next 6 hours.
Yeah, at least for 6 hours. Go to bed. So she loved it.
It's
but
3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right. But that's really what kind of caused the downfall of it. So we said that Pac-Man was 7 million. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Do you remember one of the worst movies ever created? It was kind of notoriously terrible. You were talking about bad games that got rushed to market, and there was a big hype about them. Do you remember the worst movie or worst game ever made on the 2600 console?
Yes, and that's coming. So do you remember, Steve?
Yep.
E.T.
I won't. Yes, E.T. I won't. I didn't mean to.
No, you're good.
If you're about to talk about it, I won't spoil the fun.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but absolutely. So that was really the beginning of the end for Atari. So, but before I get to that, so we talked about Pac-Man selling at that time. It was the biggest selling video game of all time at 7 million. As of today, what is the biggest selling video game of all time, and how many millions of copies has it sold?
I'm gonna guess Mario Brothers is the title.
You mean Atari or just
of all time in general? Just the biggest video game of all time. Go ahead and Google, Noel. It's fine. I'll wait.
No.
I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding.
I'm not going. It's not Pac-Man. It's not Miss Pac-Man.
No, it's actually it's relatively newer game. And it'll totally make sense to you when I say it. So let me just go on. There's two. The biggest selling copies of a video game of all time is the game Tetris. 520 million copies sold. But as far as money return, at 300 million copies sold, as of 2023, it's probably been a little bit more. But Minecraft is actually the biggest selling video game of all time.
How about that?
That's crazy.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I remember the craze that kids had with that, and it was really a pretty cool game what you could make with that. It's like Legos for the computer. Pretty wild for TV.
My son played that a lot when he was growing up.
Yeah, mine too.
I mean, and I would go up there and watch him, and I was like, he would spend hours and hours playing that, and I'm like, this has to be the most innocent game in the world.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just like digital Legos, basically.
Yeah.
I mean,
the bit quality wasn't a highly intensive graphics game, very basic in all its form. It was kind of funny that caught on and created such a craze,
100%.
So pretty wild.
Yep.
But yeah, so a lot of different things. But yeah, so Atari created a bunch of different consoles. They created the 2600, and right after that, there was a video game system. They were really, really seriously figuring. This is kind of like I'm going back to the albums that we talked about, how basic they were. So let's double the 2600 and call the next one the 5200. That's exactly what they did, right? Yeah. And so the 5200 was created. And then after the 5200 was the $7,800. Yeah. So 1982, the 5200, 1986 was the 7,800, but really there was never quite the catch on of an Atari console than the 52 or the 2600. There was the first computer that they tried was the Atari ST. They tried to create actually a laptop type of computer called the Atari Portfolio. In 1989, the Atari Lynx was the first ever handheld console with a color display and a backlit screen. Large fanfare, but shortage of parts kept the system from being released nationwide for the Christmas season. And the Lynx lost market share to Nintendo's Game Boy, which basically the rest is history there, right? So then they tried to stay in the loop and compete with things like Sega and a Nintendo with the Atari Jaguar, which was launched around the same time in 1993. But again, going back to the heyday of the 2600, it just never ever caught on. And really, what caused the downfall was in the early 80s. There was a pretty big video game crash in 1983. And basically what happened was it just the market got super overpriced or super oversaturated. And again, it was a lot of mid quality games that people were just tired of putting money into an undervalued product. And that goes with this whole story about the video game of ET, right? It was around that same time. So it was in 1982 that this game hit the 2600. And it was, again, one of those games that was extremely, extremely rushed to market for the Christmas season. Yeah. 5 weeks it was created. I didn't hate it. Honestly, I didn't hate it when I played it. I thought it was interesting, but it was frustrating because you were constantly falling in those caves and all sorts of stuff. Yes. But anyway,
the gameplay was weird.
Yeah,
like it was you expected it to be somewhat like the movie, and it bared very little resemblance to it, other than you had this little toad looking thing that was supposed to be
its neck would stretch every once in a while if you hit the button
neck
right.
would stretch.
That was about it. But so that kind of created a huge spiraling of disinterest in the video game industry. Really had some problems there. And then then there was a fierce competition. There were too many consoles trying to replicate it, and so that caused this video game crash. And so there were losses that were totaled at more than $500 million. Warner, who owned it, their stock price went from $60 to $20 a share, and they were looking for a buyer. And then Ray Kassar resigned, who was one of the one of the CEOs for the company at that time. So, and really going back to the whole ET story, that lends into a whole completely different conversation, because legend was out there that for many years that Atari built so many ET games that didn't make, that in order to hide what a big blunder that they did, they decided to bury like thousands of copies of this game.
Millions.
Yeah, like millions of these games. That's what it was. I mean, it was rumored that it could have been up to 1 million games that they decided to bury in a landfill in a New Mexico desert. And interestingly enough, there is a Netflix special called Atari Game Over. And if you all are video game fans at all, I highly encourage you to watch this show. So what they did is there was some people that did some history investigating, and they came up with an approximation that outside of the town of Alamogordo, New Mexico, there was the location that they felt that some of these cartridges were buried. And so I don't know if you remember the movie Ready Player One, but that gentleman that wrote that was out there where he brought his DeLorean. It was a big spectacle. And even some of the old Atari employees who had heard about this, but never knew it for sure, actually came out to see if it was really true, which I thought was really fascinating. So, but anyway, I don't remember exactly the year that this happened, but was it 2014? Okay. Mm-hmm. So they were able to get a backhoe and excavate this site. And sure enough, they were able to uncover a bunch of different Atari, but there were a bunch of other, ET, but there were a bunch of other video game cartridges that were buried in this area too. So this legend actually was resolved as true, that there was a bunch of copies of ET that was buried in the desert to hide the complete mistake that they made overestimating the success of this cartridge. So I think that's so fascinating.
They made 4 to 5 million copies of
it,
and they sold 1.5 million, and then all the retailers were returning all their inventory back to the maker. So they had all these cartridges, and so
that's crazy, isn't it?
Took them out to the landfill, and you're right. You're saying they found other cartridges. They found ET, Centipede, Defender, lots of them that were buried, hopefully never to be found. But then that group in 2014 went out there and found them. So I thought that's pretty interesting.
It's just wild, I mean, it's just wild to see. I mean, you talk about it's kind of like the history of Atari kind of is equivalent to companies like Kodak and some of these other companies that were literally the king of their realm. And by bad mismanagement, bad ownership decisions, went from the dominant force of the world to just a massive fall from dominance, and it basically caused by a combination of poor management, product failures, increased competition, and a failure to adapt to market changes. Right. So it's to me, it will always still be near and dear to me, the story of Atari. And I can tell you, I will post pictures. I found pictures the other day of me, playing this console at Christmas morning, and the games that were there. To me, it was the thing that got me excited about the video game industry, to where to this day, I mean, last night I was up till 2 a.m. playing stinking Sniper Elite. Okay. So, I mean, but it all stemmed from probably playing Combat or the horrible port of Pac-Man. I just love the nostalgia of it. In fact, on my Nintendo Switch, I have the Atari Legend, the classic, 200 games for Atari. And I even last night when I was researching this, I pulled it out. And it's funny because now, you realize how great those games were when you were a kid, and now you play them. You're like, how did I stay on this for hours? These games are so boring. It's funny, but at the time they were so revolutionary. So
I'm curious, do y'all remember the rival game system to the Atari 2600?
Wasn't
Coleco?
it the Intellivision or ColecoVision, wasn't it?
Well, that may be true. We had in our household, we did not have a 2600. We were like one of the few kids in the neighborhood. Like I was like, why do we have this instead of the Atari 2600? Right. And we had the Magnavox Odyssey 2.
Oh yeah, the Odyssey.
Oh my gosh!
And,
wow!
And I remember how cool I thought it was because it had the keyboard, but it was like a touchpad. It was like a flat surface. They were actually.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I hardly remember the thing, but I was racking my brain while Keith was talking, trying to figure out what was that machine that we had. And I finally realized what it was. But we graduated to the 5200 though, so we were so excited to have an Atari system in our house. And it was a cool design. Had the little compartment at the top where you could hide your controllers in and everything.
But it was big.
Yeah, it was big, and the controllers were the biggest issue with the system because they quickly lost their. They just they were like this weird texture, and then they just the side buttons especially would fail quickly, and once that happened, it was worthless. And
you got a brick there,
and
right?
then the controllers were
expensive,
not cheap. So failure.
I remember I had a 7800, and my older brother Steve went off to college, and he somehow ended up with my 7800, and somebody broke into his apartment and stole it.
Oh, that stinks.
And I'm still like, damn it. Like, not that I would ever want it back or anything, but
it just bums you out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
but
man.
Yeah, one of my good friends when I was growing up had the Intellivision, and we'd go over there and play that, and it was like the little pad thing,
like the little thumb pad thing. I remember.
Yeah, I was terrible at that. It was, that's why I'm still terrible at like the flat pad on the laptop. I hate that thing. But
it's kind of the precursor of that. So I remember going over. I spent the night at one of my friend's house that had an Intellivision, and in the back of my head, I'm like, this is actually better. Like the graphics and everything are better, but it just
the graphics were better. The gameplay was better. It was far better from a game quality standpoint for sure. But I could not get over the controller. It was so bad.
Frustrating. So.
And of course my friend, because it was his, he would just spank the crap out of me playing. We played television baseball, and I'm like, this isn't even fun for me. Like it really isn't. It's 28,463 to 2. And we're playing baseball. So
you're saying there's a chance.
Yeah, this is awful. And he's like, home run.
Somehow I just turned my Alexa on by saying there's a chance. I don't know how. Anyway, so what were your favorite video games on the Atari? Just out of curiosity.
I liked Missile Command and Yar's Revenge and Pitfall. Those are my 3 go-tos.
Yes. Yeah. What about you, Steve?
Definitely Pitfall. I like Pac-Man. I got bored with it after a while though. Mm-hmm. But really those 2.
Yeah. I Pitfall, I think, is everybody's one of the top for everybody. I would argue. I remember there was a game that was it was called Star Raiders, and it was one of the first ones that you had this other little keypad that you had to use in addition to the joystick. So it was the first time where you had like multiple things to do. So I even though the game was really horrible, it was just really cool to me that it was so unique. Yeah. So I would say probably, and River Raid. I would say River Raid was also
River Raid was good. Yeah, I like that one.
That was a really good one. So yeah, I would say that was probably my 3 favorite. But anyway, so that's just a little deep dive. Interestingly enough, so the Atari of today, they're trying to revive the Atari console called a VCS console. They've actually gotten into blockchain technology. So there's a lot of different things that Atari's been purchased. The name has been purchased over multiple different companies, but today that's kind of more what they're going into, but it's just not the same image that we remember for sure. Yeah. So anyway, that's the deep dive I've got for the company called Atari. May they always live in our hearts.
Yeah. Good job, buddy. That was good.
Yeah, that was fun.
I feel like we went back in time, and it was a very nostalgic episode you just threw together there, bud.
It's a good one. I was trying to think of what my first deep dive would be, and I'm like, well, I mean, it's got to be something with Atari, because I mean, it was either that or Star Wars, because that's pretty much what my life was in the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah. So it's a good one. I just good memories of the Atari system. So
it's great that
appreciate it, guys.
We were the first generation to play video games and play outside.
Yeah,
and of course, the more current generations, they hardly spend any time outside. But I'm glad that I'm always thankful that we're Gen Xers, because I think we grew up during.
Oh, I agree.
Amazing time, seen a lot of amazing things and a lot of developments, and it's pretty dang cool.
I agree, definitely. Well, guys, we'll wrap it up, but hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. I'd be curious, what was your all's favorite video game system for our listeners? And of that, what was your favorite game that you played? Please let us know. Join our Facebook page, join our social media channels. We will be launching this podcast and showing links to all of those. If you get that link, give us a comment. Tell us what your favorite games were, favorite consoles were. I'd really be curious to see who all enjoyed this era and was able to enjoy some games with us, and maybe remind me of the one that I've forgotten. So it'd be kind of neat to see.
Yeah.
So thanks, everybody, and we will catch you again on the next episode of the Gen X Journey.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the Gen X Journey podcast belong solely to the hosts and guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of any entity they are associated with. The information provided is for entertainment and informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. Listeners are encouraged to seek the advice of qualified professionals for any specific issues they may face. The creators and contributors of this podcast make no representations as to the accuracy, completeness, or validity of any information, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its use.